presentation is going to focus on Module 2 from a handbook for classroom management that works, which focuses on establishing rules and procedures for the beginning and the ending of a period or a school day. It's important to establish rules and procedures for beginning and ending a class period or a school day because it essentially sets the tone for how your classroom is going to go, not only just for that school day or that period, but for the entire year. It allows you to get the most out of your instructional time in the class. You're not wasting time trying to get students on task, and you're not taking time away from the students trying to get them out the door. Having these rules and procedures allows for students to know what to expect in the classroom. They're not questioning what's going to happen next. And it finally reinforces structure and consistency in their classroom. They know exactly what's going to happen next. They know exactly what to do without you having to tell them over and over again because you have those certain rules and procedures set in place. Some recommendations that I have found for beginning a class period or a school day include beginning class with learning activities, or what Marzano in the handbook for classroom management has described as administrivia. Establishing some activities in your classroom that reinforce classroom unity or bring your class together for the day. Posting your learning objectives for the period or the day somewhere visible for the students to see. And finally, establishing procedures for entering your classroom and for starting your classroom activities. A recommendation from Marzano himself, and even from myself using it in my own classroom, is beginning your class with some kind of learning activity, or what he coins as administrivia. Now, Marzano says administrivia is all those administrative tasks that we do at the beginning of a class, such as taking attendance of our students, handing out homework assignments, or getting students assignments if they were absent the previous day. So all those tedious tasks are usually things that we try to get out of the way in the beginning of the class, which aren't necessarily a bad thing, but they do have the suggestion in the book to make the most time of yourself and for your students, so that way you're not wasting their time. So while you're doing these administrivia tasks, you could also be doing something such as a sponge activity or bell work or some kind of daily warm-up or starter to keep the students busy, so that way they're being engaged with the activity or being engaged with what it is you're wanting them to learn for the day, but you're also getting some of those tedious tasks done and out of the way in the start of class. Another recommendation for beginning a class period or a school day is to establish some classroom activities that reinforce your classroom unity. A lot of times, especially in the middle school, we are beginning our class together, and we might not even see these students later on in the day. They might just be in that one classroom with you. They like to have that feeling of community or togetherness. And in a handbook for classroom management that works, Marzano et al. Says that students that feel like they are in a community feel like they're more going to be part of the solution rather than the problem. So having that sense of togetherness kind of gives the students something more accountable to hold themselves towards. Some activities that you can do to reinforce your classroom unity is to acknowledge birthdays in the room for the day, or important events that are happening maybe in particular students' lives or just the whole class in general. You can also use this time to acknowledge classroom achievements and classroom activities that you're having. And you can also use this time to do something as simple as giving classroom announcements, and to also say like the Pledge of Allegiance or some kind of classroom code that you might create together. Another recommendation that I found on Yale University's website under their Pourvu Center for Teaching and Learning. It was an article actually about managing the classroom titled The Beginning and End of Class. is to post your learning objectives for this school day or your school session or your period. And even in my personal classroom, I already post my learning objectives, but I only just post them. I don't really make those connections with the students. So that's where the classroom management key comes into play. Making sure that those learning objectives are visible for students is the first step. You want to make sure that the students can see exactly what it is they're going to be learning for that day. And it almost makes a visible checklist for the students so that they can look up at that board and say, okay, this is what we're going to be learning today. Here's what I should start doing. Like I stated earlier, making sure that students understand those learning objectives, I feel like is a lot of times where we struggle as teachers. It's enough to just post those learning objectives, but to actually go through it with students in student-friendly language so that the students know what they're going to be learning without you having to repeat it to them or without you having to mention it to them. They can just look up at the board and say, okay, this is our plan for the day. Here is what we're doing. And finally, keeping that learning objective meaningful and relevant to the students so that way they are actually engaged with what they're going to be learning. They're motivated to do that learning, and it's going to keep them interested. It's going to hold their interest through that learning period or that class session. So once they see those learning objectives right when they walk in the door, they already have a roadmap of what they're going to be doing for that day. The second part of this classroom management strategy includes recommendations for ending a class period or a school day. Some of these recommendations come from a handbook for classroom management that works, and some of the recommendations again come from the Yale University's Center for Learning recommendations, as well as recommendations that I personally have used. Recommendations include ending your class period with activities that are going to reinforce students' learning and their disciplines in class, reviewing or summarizing learning for that day through exercises. So I'll give you a list of different ways that you can review information for students so that way the learning is not lost on them. And lastly, I have a recommendation to post or even just discuss out loud different classroom reminders for the day or guidelines that students are going to need, whether it be for homework or for classroom reminders in general. In a handbook for classroom management that works, the strategy that they give for ending a class period or a school day is to end your class with activities that are going to reinforce students' learning and discipline in that class period or whatever it is that they were learning for that time. These activities establish predictability in your classroom. That way students know that they will have some kind of exit activity that they are going to have to do at the closure of a lesson before they begin packing up their things. It has that consistency in the classroom where they know this is going to happen. It prevents you from having to tell them, okay, now it's time to pack up, because they know that they're going to have to do some kind of activity first. Some various closure activities that I've used in the past include exit tickets. Just on the right is just a quick little exit ticket that you could use personally to have your students turn in before they exit the door. I usually just give my students a sticky note or have them tear a little sheet out of their notebook to write down one thing that they've learned from that class period or a word that is resonating with them from the class period. And these activities are meant to check for understanding for students to make sure that they are understanding the material or the content for the day and that they're sitting on that material and reflecting on it as well. Another one that I've used is called Beat the Clock. They'll have 10, 15, 20 seconds to think about an answer to a question that I ask out loud. And at the end of that time period, I'll just randomly say a student's name, and that student will have to give me some kind of answer. There are no right or wrong answers in this, so I always give positive reinforcement to these students, and then I move on to another question. Stand up, hand up, pair up is another one my students have used before. They just stand up, put their hand up, and high-five another student in the classroom, or if it's an uneven class, they might have to have a group of 3. But I'll ask a question of those groups, and then they will answer back with each other. And a final ending activity is, I'll just coin the term called tap your thought. It is a strategy that I have kind of fostered into my classroom using classroomscreen.com. There is an app on the side of the screen where you can flash up kind of a check for understanding interactive board on your smartboard. You can ask a question of the students on the screen, and then there's sections where the students can come up to the board and tap a thumbs up or a thumbs down. They can do a smiley face all the way to a sad face. There's also in between faces. It's another strategy to check for understanding from students at the end of class. And these students, once the prompt is given to them, they'll get out of their seats, come and tap the screen, and then go and pack up their things for the day. So I like to end with activities at the end of class, again, just to show students that there is still learning to be had before you can start packing up. It also keeps that management under control of you not trying to get students to answer questions and ask questions of each other while there's other students in the back zipping up their book bags or putting their pencils away in their pouches. Another recommendation for ending a class period or a day is to review or summarize your learning for the day through various exercises. I foresee this one happening more in secondary classrooms, as you are asking the students to do a little bit more than just a one-word or a one-phrase reflection on their learning to check for that understanding for the end of the day. This is really essentially a time for students to ask questions about their learning for the day, or maybe even homework assignments that they're given if they have a question on a particular problem. So that way they're not wasting their time throughout the day or wasting time throughout class period. They have an established time at the end of class that they're given to ask these particular questions to have them answered. Some different reflection activities for this level include quick writes, where they're given a prompt, given some time, and given maybe a sentence minimum or maybe just a page minimum requirement of writing that they have to do to reflect with this prompt that they are given to answer. Summarizing the content that they've learned for the day. This can be done in their notes that they have taken for the day, or again, just on a sheet of paper that they might hand out the door. Reviewing their learning objectives. We talked about at the beginning of the class period to post their learning objectives and to reflect on those learning objectives with students. Now at the end of class, you'll go back and review the learning objectives to see if they hit the learning objectives for the day or if there's still any questions on what the learning objectives were or if they actually talked about the learning objectives in the lesson plan. And finally, another quick way that they can review or summarize their learning for the day is through a mind map. This gives the students a chance to jot down quick words or phrases or connections that they had to the learning for the day without having to do it as a big writing piece. Now, this feels a little bit like the ending activities that reinforce the learning from the previous slide, and they are similar. It's just that I feel like this is more what secondary level students would do, and maybe the first slide would be more learning activities for elementary level, but it's not grounded to either level. You can use summarizing in high school, you can use summarizing in third grade. It's just whatever's going to connect with those students, and also giving those students that sense of consistency on what they know is going to happen at the end of the class period. They know that every day they're going to have to summarize their learning, or every day they're going to have to create a mind map, something that's going to make that connection for them. Another management strategy for the end of the day is to post or even just discuss your classroom reminders or guidelines that you have to go over with the students. This is going to eliminate students asking questions at the end of the class period on what they're supposed to be doing, maybe for that particular night of homework time or what needs to be done for the next day in class. It helps them from feeling lost in the classroom if they see the guidelines or if they discuss the reminders of what's going to be happening in class. Then they'll have that feeling of understanding and knowing what's going on in the room. It gives kind of a checklist of what's going to be expected for the students, maybe for the next class period or the next school day. For me personally, I like to post my classroom reminders in a specific reminder board right next to the door, so that way when students are exiting the door, not only have they heard me say the reminder, but they also see the reminders on the way out. These reminders can include materials that they might need for the next class or what they need for their homework assignment. The reminders include homework assignments for that night or just important due dates that are coming up for projects, assignments, or other due dates. And finally, just other classroom reminders. So if they have a permission slip needed for a future date, if they have an upcoming picture day or some kind of class or school event coming up, that'll also be included in their reminder board. Again, this just eliminates students from asking questions that waste your classroom time or wastes their time. They'll have that specific time at the end of class to see those reminders or ask questions about those reminders or even just interact with those reminders on their way out the door. It's going to be important for you to establish these rules and procedures early on in the school year for beginning and ending your class period or your class's day. Establishing these rules and procedures is going to keep you as the teacher and your students accountable. If you know the rules and your students know the rules, then when one or the other is broken, you guys can hold each other accountable, maybe by simply pointing at the rule or just reminding about the rule or even reviewing or practicing that rule again if it needs to be reviewed. Having these rules established and these procedures established in the classroom is going to keep your classroom consistent for the beginning and ending of your period. It might seem redundant at the beginning of the school year, constantly reviewing and going over these rules and practicing them during an instructional time that you could be using for teaching, but it's going to pay off in the long run. The more that you practice it in the beginning, the more that it starts to set in and sink in for students, and the more apt they are to understanding those rules and procedures earlier on. Something that you can take it as you will. I usually just post my rules and procedures right next to my door. When students are entering the room, they see the rules and procedures for how class is going to begin. And when they exit the door, they see the rules and procedures for how class is going to end. It's still visible to the students when they're sitting down in their chairs in the instructional time, and it's visible as they're out the door. I have a different layout in my room, so it works for me. It might not work for your classroom, but that's what's been working in mine. And finally, constantly reviewing these rules and procedures, practicing these rules and procedures through maybe role play or discussion, and then reinforcing the rules if they're broken or if they're not being managed in the way that you want them to be, is really going to help students understand and know what you want their classroom to look like. So earlier on in the school year, introducing the rules and procedures, practicing with them, reinforcing them in the long run is going to allow you to manage your classroom in the way that you want it to be managed. In conclusion, beginning and ending your class period or your school day is going to be an important aspect when it comes to managing your classroom and the way that you want your classroom to run. Having rules and procedures established for these specific times in your instructional day allow for this manageable classroom that's going to be consistent for the students. It's going to be predictable in that they know what's going to be happening during these times, and it's going to make for a worthwhile instructional time. You're not going to be wasting the instructional time that you have set out for your lesson for that day if you have rules and procedures in place for when students enter and exit your classroom. Through this presentation, I have given you a variety of strategies that one can use to begin or end your class period or your school day. These are not all of the strategies that are out there. These are just ones that I have used personally or ones that I have found to be of useful information for you. And finally, it's important that you establish these rules and procedures early on in your classroom or early on in your school year, so that way students have time to reflect on and understand and review exactly what it is you want from them during these time periods of your school day. And through practicing and reinforcement of these rules and procedures, students are able to give to you what it is you are wanting from them throughout the school day. The following slide is a list of references that I use, which include our text, a handbook for classroom management that works, as well as Yale University's website, specifically their Poorvu Center for Teaching and Learning, on an article titled The Beginning and End of Class.